What if I told you that time itself was once turned into money? Not as a metaphor, but as a real system that reshaped how economies function, how power is distributed, and how the modern world operates at a global scale, even though most people never stop to question it. For most of human history, time was not standardized or universal, but local, inconsistent, and deeply tied to nature, with each town setting its own clocks based on the position of the sun, meaning that noon in one place could be completely different from noon somewhere else just a short distance away. And for centuries, this didn't create major problems because economies were local, trade was slow, and distance naturally separated markets from each other. But as industrialization accelerated and railways expanded across continents, the world began to move faster. And suddenly that small inconsistency turned into a serious problem, because trains started running on different local times, creating confusion in scheduling, misalignment between routes, and in some cases, actual collisions that had nothing to do with engineering failures, but everything to do with the lack of a shared understanding of time. What had once been a minor inconvenience became a systemic risk, and at that moment, time stopped being just something people observed in nature and became something that needed to be controlled, measured, and standardized. Because once transportation, communication, and trade depend on precision, time itself becomes part of the infrastructure. The solution to this chaos began to emerge in the 19th century, centered around a single reference point at the Royal Observatory Greenwich, where a standardized system known as Greenwich Mean Time was developed. And over time, this system spread quietly but decisively, first through railway networks, then through shipping routes, and eventually across global financial systems. As more institutions adopted this shared time standard, something subtle but extremely powerful happened. Because standardizing time didn't just fix scheduling problems, it enabled coordination at a scale that had never been possible before, allowing factories to operate more efficiently, markets to open and close in predictable cycles, and global trade to function with precision instead of uncertainty. At that point, time was no longer just being measured. It was being used as a tool to organize labor, to optimize production, and to synchronize entire economic systems. And once something can be measured and compared, it naturally becomes something that can be valued, tracked, and eventually priced. Work became tied to hours, productivity became tied to minutes, and efficiency became something that could be quantified and improved, which fundamentally changed how economies function. Because now output wasn't just about what you produced, but how fast and how consistently you could produce it. This is where the shift becomes deeper, because when time becomes measurable and standardized across a system, it stops being a background variable and becomes a core asset, something that influences wages, production, and even financial outcomes in ways that most people don't consciously recognize. Workers began to be paid by the hour. Factories calculated output based on time units, and markets started reacting not just to events, but to the timing of those events, creating a system where speed and synchronization became as important as resources themselves. But there is another layer to this transformation that is often overlooked, because time wasn't just standardized, it was centralized, meaning that the authority to define what time is and how it is measured shifted away from local communities and into a controlled system that could be applied globally. And whenever a system becomes centralized, it creates a new form of power, because whoever defines the framework ultimately influences how everything inside that framework operates, from trade and communication to finance and production. Over time, this invisible structure became so deeply embedded in daily life that it feels completely natural as people wake up, check their phones, schedule their work, and interact with systems that depend entirely on synchronized global time, without ever questioning where that system came from or how it shapes their decisions. Modern economies don't just run on capital or resources, they run on timing, because stock markets open and close at exact moments. Supply chains depend on precise coordination, and even small delays can create significant financial consequences, especially in systems that operate at high speed. In many cases, the difference between profit and loss is not what action is taken, but when it is taken, which means that time is no longer just a measurement of events, but a factor that directly influences economic outcomes. This is why time can be understood as a form of currency, not in the sense that it replaces money, but in the sense that it functions within the system in a similar way, as something that can be allocated, optimized, and used to create value. The shift that began with railway scheduling did more than solve a logistical issue. It introduced a new layer of economic infrastructure, one that is largely invisible but absolutely essential. Because just like money, time only works as a system when everyone agrees on it. And once that agreement exists, it becomes incredibly powerful, shaping how economies operate, how markets behave, and how individuals make decisions, often without them even realizing it. The people who first standardized time did not set out to create a financial mechanism. They were trying to solve a coordination problem. But in doing so, they created a system that transformed how value is measured and how economic activity is structured. And today, whether you notice it or not, you interact with that system constantly because every schedule, every deadline, and every transaction is influenced by the same standardized framework. Time is not just something you observe. It is something you use. And in many ways, it is something you spend. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe to Capital Historian because history doesn't just explain the past, it reveals the systems you are already living inside.